We're going to talk about our trending topic today, which is the psychology of guns. And 2 points before we jump in. First is that we really felt the need to talk about this for obvious reasons. But the second is that we didn't want to just be another group of chattering heads that say the same thing and complain and say nothing gets done and all the kind of usual things that we hear when we turn on the cable news cycle. But we've got psychology backgrounds that we want to see if we can bring psychology into this conversation and how psychology might be able to help this conversation. So the first question I have about it is really about why this, you think, psychologically has become such an intractable topic where there's no budging, where there's not the ability to talk about it in a constructive or meaningful way seems so locked up. What's your take on why this topic in particular?
I mean, it's hard to talk about it without, talking about it politically. But I think psychologically, for some people, they look at guns and sort of the freedom of guns as sort of a desire to not be overly governed, maybe. That they see that this is a freedom and there's a fear of losing some of those freedoms, but also a fear of losing freedoms from people who they see as very different from them, either politically or psychologically. And I think it's the same. It's probably the same mentality if you look at abortion or just different societal issues, that it's a very this is about me versus us.
I'll kind of piggyback on that because I think that's very accurate. There's a lot of concerns about government overreach in terms of whenever we involve the government on things, it tends to get complicated. But I will comment, from my perspective, the civil rights movement and guns are obviously not related, but I think where I see the change with guns is that for guns, this movement it's taking away people's rights to bear arms, essentially, versus the civil rights movement was getting people to have things, to get rights. And so I feel like there is kind of this piece where it's a removal of a right, quote unquote. And I don't think anybody is saying like, oh, it's not reasonable to take away all the guns. Like that's just not going to happen with over 350 million guns in this country. So I think it's about finding the middle ground, and that's hard to do.
Yeah, it really, to me, three things stand out. One is fear. So when fear comes into play, irrational thinking, very black and white, all or nothing thinking, we're seeing that. I think it's about how people view the role of government. For some, it's distrust, and they don't like the idea of the government having a say in any type of aspect of their life. So the less government or national governmental oversight, the better. And other people see the role of government is to kind of legislate and to become involved in things that they believe are such fundamental rights or issues that they can't leave it up into the hands of communities or more local or state. And then I think the third is that we've gotten to a point where there is such divisive and nasty rhetoric so that we're really having difficulty sitting down and having a very thoughtful and respectful conversation about the issue because we are name-calling and we are demonizing the other side, and we're throwing out all these labels that naturally just leave us in this state of defensiveness and defending ourselves and what we believe rather than tackling the issue at hand.
So to that last point, do you think part of this is that we are so polarized and divisive that we're going to dig into this position because that's our team and less about I am particularly concerned about gun rights, but more about like I'm not going to give ground because that is a position that our team is taking? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, I think we're not going to give ground because that's the position of my team. And I don't want to say much about this, but this goes back to sort of how I see the United States right now is more of an oligarchy, and that money gets votes. And that's why there's no movement. And it's very disappointing and very frustrating.
I feel like one of the things that is kind of something that's a prominent theme in general in our society is just a lack of awareness and a lack of being mindful of, whether it's tone, a voice, your body language, and especially words that we're putting in text and tweets. And I think what we have to do is ask ourselves, okay, so when somebody says something, maybe you post something and you get like a nasty troll response, asking yourself, okay, well, why am I reacting so strongly to their words? Mm-hmm. If this is something that I believe in and is important, I don't see why we can't try to have a conversation about it. So it's the emotion piece that I get stuck on.
I think it's emotion. I also think it's education. And I feel like I say this in every podcast, but the social media phenomenon. Because there was a representative of our federal government that said on the news on Wednesday that Japan does not have mass shootings because they don't have video games there. And I'm like, that guy's elected.
Right. And just to be clear, they have actually higher rates per capita of video game use than the U.S.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and that to me is kind of a good transition to our next part of this, which is that it is hard to talk about what we know to be factual without it sounding partisan. And for example, that's a good example. I was interviewed yesterday by a local reporter, and the whole frame of it was around video games, and aren't these video games that are violent, mm-hmm. promoting violence are part of the problem? And I said flat no. Yeah. And I gave a lot of reasons why. And we know the research does not line up with video games having any direct causation to long-term violent behavior. We know that the facts are not in the direction of video games are the culprit. We know, and so if you say, well, here are these explanations. It's video games. Well, no, it's mental illness. Well, then you'd have to explain why are there mass shootings in the U.S. and not in other countries that have the same base rates of mental illness.
Right.
If you say it's pure evil, then why are people in the United States more evil? Every time you kind of throw these things up, they don't make sense. That one variable is the number of guns and the accessibility of guns. So I know that sounds partisan, but that's what the research says. That's what mm-hmm. we know. I will say, though, there is a little bit of a nuance to it, and it does matter why someone has a gun. So the research says if you have a family that grows up with guns, that they teach gun safety, and they use guns for hunting or for sport, that actually the rates of gun violence aren't especially high among those families, especially. Not saying it never happens, but it's just not especially high. If you have a gun more for protection, if you have a gun for out of a sense of over fascination with guns, not for the other reasons, then your rates of gun violence tend to be higher. So there's a little bit of a nuance to it, but bottom line is that there's a issue with the presence of guns. That's the variable. Emma Kate?
So I'm going to add to what you were saying because, again, my fiance is law enforcement, and I actually had some really interesting conversations with him because, again, I didn't grow up with guns, so I'm still learning. And so one of the things that he always talks about is most of the time, and this is not always true, but on average, the law-abiding citizens that have guns are respectful of the gun, and they teach, proper use of it and the power of it. And the reality is a lot of the people that are committing violent acts with weapons are criminals who are going to be doing other things that are against the law. And so then I think that's where there is kind of this divisiveness over, okay, well, we want to take away this thing for people that's used for good, right? Like, again, some people actually use guns still for hunting, and not everybody's okay with that, but The reality is humans eat meat, and that's just what we used to do. So it just gets really sticky.
Mhm. Any other thoughts about the being able to talk about just really what we know about the presence of guns themselves being the thing we can't talk about, and how we need to be able to talk about that in a way that isn't necessarily shutting down conversation, dialogue, or respectful disagreement. Is there any thought about that?
Well, I think we're really in a time right now where there is oversimplification, there's sweeping broad statements and labeling of other people. I mean, the data suggests that the majority of conservatives and liberals believe in tighter gun control and restriction. But then when it comes to passing legislation, there seems to be gridlock in that regard. So it has to be then, in some way, shape, or form, how the politicalization and the messaging somehow loses those conservative or those gun owners that believe in gun safety and common sense laws, but they're not willing then to vote on whatever goes before the legislation.
Right.
It's getting lost there somewhere.
Well, it's viewed now. Politics is viewed as a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
I win and you lose. You win and I lose. And so if here's our team and we give ground, we have lost. Not like we're going to come to some place where we both can agree. It becomes monolithic. If we give any ground, then we've lost. That's what it feels like. Even though you're right, the vast majority, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, moderates, all are in favor of universal background checks and other things that would be considered by most people to be sensible gun reform. Just sensible.
Yeah, and I think there is a devaluing of people that don't share your political or ideological position. I remember a quote many, many years ago when I watched The West Wing, and there was this one Republican character named Ainsley Hayes, and she was a conservative, and she was confronting Rob Lowe's character, and they were talking about guns, and she said, you know what the biggest problem you have is it's not that you don't like guns, it's you don't like people who like guns. Simply because they like guns, you do not like them. And there's this devaluing and dehumanizing people that don't share your ideology or position. And I think that's a very profound statement to make, that we are trapped in America right now.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't exactly that same point, but I will say I'm someone that grew up, I did like guns. I liked skeet shooting. I liked target practice. So I did that. And yet, as someone who liked guns, I made a very specific decision not to have guns in my house when I have children, because the research said that the chances of a child being hurt by a gun are greater when there's a gun in the house. So I didn't have a gun in the house. And I support very sensible gun reform. So this is really the last part of this question that I want to ask is, how do we, as psychologists, mental health therapists, social scientists, use psychology to help with this process, help with this conversation? Because we're at a place where all the things we're saying are true. Most people agree, and yet we can't make movement politically. Things are too polarized, and we can't get past demonizing the other side, and so on. What are some psychology principles or things that we know from clinical practice or from research that can help with this process?
Well, I've actually used this, and Dave, you've taught me most everything I know about this, but it's around motivational interviewing.
Which, explain that.
Actually, you do a better job explaining it succinctly, so why don't you do that?
Well, motivational interviewing is an approach to when someone has a difficulty that they're dug in on. So the most common example would be, let's say someone's had 2 or 3 DUIs, they drink every night, they've fallen and injured themselves, their partner has left them, and they come in and you say, do you think you have a drinking problem? And they say no, which, by the way, is shockingly common. And motivational interviewing is taking someone that's got something that is dug in that they're defensive or resistant about, and having a way of helping them come to a place where they decide they want to make a change.
Right.
And it's a subtle process, but it is a powerful process. So that's the backstory.
So I'll give not necessarily a gun example, but I've had conversations with people about that. But it's basically trying to make it personal to someone. I don't want to go into specifics here, but it's basically you go to somebody who supports an elected official, and then you ask them, so do you feel like your daughters feel comfortable being around a man that says grab him by the you-know-what? And so you're forced in this situation to where it's personal. It's like, well, no. And so then what do you do with that discomfort? How do you shift that person? And so the Japan example. So you believe that there are no video games in Japan, even though Sony's PlayStation was built there.
So can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Because I feel like first I'm not tracking, but I think more importantly, from my perspective, the spirit of motivational interviewing is all about being open to listening. It's open to hearing their opinions, their thoughts without trying to convince them.
Or allowing them to hear their opinions and thoughts and feel that dissonance, that something doesn't match. And then they're going to have to shift.
But and I guess maybe my point is we learn by listening, and that cracks the door open. So when it comes to the therapeutic relationship, it's really hard to establish trust, especially in situations like this where maybe you've got a teen that's struggling with marijuana or alcohol abuse. Their parents are forcing them to come in, and every single person in their life is telling them, you got to change, you need to do this, X, Y, or Z. And for somebody to just sit there and authentically listen to their perspective, and yes, we're making some subtle changes where we're trying to facilitate something called change talk, and we're rolling with resistance. The reality is that openness to listening, it cracks the door for them to potentially shift and potentially go in another direction where maybe they never would have gone before.
Yeah, and I use a motivational interviewing a lot, be working with young adult men and working a lot with substance issues, but also do a lot of marriage and family. And so when I think about how you broker compromise in families or in a marriage when there's gridlock, when they're stuck, and this works in therapy, it also works in politics, is that you got to find common ground. You got to find a compromise. And in some ways, we need courageous people on both sides of the aisle to stand up and say, it's not that I'm a Democrat. It's not that I'm a Republican. I'm going to reach across the aisle and we're going to come together and say, this is a human rights. This is a safety issue. This isn't a political issue, to start championing a common sense, common ground law, break it down into smaller, non-sweeping, all or nothing sort of steps. And part of compromise in politics and in marriage and relationships is give and take. You know, if the Liberal Party really wants to make more a movement with gun laws and gun control, then what are you willing to Emma Kate's point, listen to the other side, and something that's really important to them, show some goodwill gesture towards that, and find common ground where you can budge in that regard. And we know this is possible. We just also know we've seemed to reach an impasse with the topic of guns.
Let me give another principle that I think might be helpful, and this is just simply stated, being able to think win-win. And I'm going to use a family example first, and then I'm going to talk about this in this context. Let's say there is an 17-year-old kid, junior in high school, and he wants to go to the lake with his friends for Friday night, and he's going to sleep over and come back Saturday. And the parents are like, no, we know what people are going to be doing there. It's not going to be safe. They're going to be drinking. They're going to be, hooking up. We don't know these people. We don't want you driving back after this. It's going to be, and so on. And so they get to this impasse where this kid wants this experience and he wants to be treated like a young adult and he wants freedom. And then you've got the parents who are like, no, we want you to be safe and we want you to not make dumb decisions. And it's framed as this thing where there's this impasse that we can't get beyond. But if you begin to think win-win, you go to the heart of it and you say, what do you want and what do I want? And maybe those things are not diametrically opposed. In other words, really what the kid wants is autonomy, being able to make their own decisions, social connection. Those are all things that the parent would want for that kid too. What does the parent want? Safety, responsibility. That's what the kid would want for himself. So if we can go down to that root issue and then work from there, how can you get what you want and I get what you want, what I want? The same thing's true. It's like there are things that people want on both sides of this that there's a lot of common ground here. People want people to be safe. They want people we want a society that is not hostile and violent. And so then we start looking at the specific concerns. Okay, well, there's some people that worry about overreach. They worry about having their rights taken away. Well, okay, we can speak to that. And then there's another side that worries about certain types of guns and weapons that make it easy for mass shootings to occur. Maybe we can work, in other words, we start getting at what is it that we can agree on, and then where can we move if we think win-win rather than zero-sum. That to me is I know it's simplistic, but it's a powerful way of thinking that we're not doing it all. We're just thinking about who's going to give, who's going to lose here, and who's going to gain. And it's really a really harmful way to frame the argument, which is like everybody ultimately wants the same thing. Yep. Last call. Any last thoughts about this? All
Again, right. I just think the one thing to maybe stick on with this is whenever you want to help somebody, you can't make them change, and that's upsetting for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, if you truly just try to understand their perspective and don't even force your thoughts and opinions on them, just listen. And after they share, you say, thank you. I appreciate learning that, and let it go. Because again, that's going to open the door to let them maybe come back to you to listen to what your views are.
Good word. Good last word. If you're interested in this topic or you have some thoughts or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can tweet us at shrink_tank, or you can write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. If you like the episode, you can help our podcast grow by giving us a good rating on iTunes and telling your friends to subscribe as well. If you didn't like it, you can give us some feedback by emailing us, feedback@shrinktank.com. And for more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture, you can visit shrinktank.com. We have great articles, videos, and podcasts, and more. You also can find links to our Doctor's Orders products, which are things that we recommend that you check out. And you can check out the description box or the show notes of this video for more. Follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank. Like us on Facebook. And if you're watching us on the YouTube channel, we'd love for you to subscribe. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, so check out the description box below. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Meryl Butler. And our marketing intern used to be Sarah Bradley. We want to say goodbye to Sarah. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hederley, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us. Make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.